I need to know what they made me forget. A human soldier discovers the shattered truth buried in light. The light on Arctics does not behave. It bends in ways that seem to mock the laws of optics, splitting shadows into twin silhouettes and casting refractions that shimmer with echoes of lost time. Beneath the violet dusk of its 24th rotational phase, Cale Draven knelt in silence beside a fissured ridge, his breath slow, disciplined like a soldier still listening for orders that would never come. He had once been part of the Mir Council's elite division, tactical memory regulation and containment, and now he was their discard. A man sentenced to exile not with bars and stone, but with warped chronology and the absence of all things familiar. Arctics, the Council claimed, was a natural anomaly preservation zone. In truth, it was a slow crucible for those they wished forgotten. Cale had been left here 10 standard cycles ago, or maybe 20. Time did not flow in straight lines here. He remembered the tribunal, or at least he remembered the room-white panels humming like restrained static, the judges behind mirrored visors. Their verdict had been simple dereliction of protocol during a field operation on Varun. But Cale had felt it in his bones even then. This was not about protocol. It was about what he had seen, what he had refused to bury. Something had gone wrong, not with him, but with the orders he was given. Time on Arctics was tethered to light. The closer to the magnetic equator, the more erratic temporal progression became. Dawn might last minutes or days. Memory often fragmented across temporal fissures, pockets of localized delay, where thoughts repeated or simply vanished. A simple walk could age your boots by 10 years and leave your lungs untouched. It wasn't the terrain that killed most exiles, it was their own minds unraveling. Cale learned early that memories couldn't be trusted. Names faded first, then faces. His own voice sometimes startled him in playback logs. He kept a record not in words but in etchings carved into slabs of ironstone, buried strategically across his makeshift compound. Dates were meaningless. Only sequences mattered, what came before what. Even then there were gaps he couldn't explain. Whole weeks went unaccounted for. He began to wonder, were these absences natural or designed? There was one entry scratched onto a rusted fragment of a comms plate that always made his pulse slow. They made me forget the mission. Not what I did, but why I did it. He didn't remember writing it, but the penmanship was his. The edge of the plate had a blood stain soaked into the oxide. Perhaps that was the only truth worth holding. It was during a reconnaissance cycle Cale had taken to calling them shifts, though they obeyed no true schedule, that he found the structure. At first glance it looked like a jagged column of quartz, maybe 10 meters high, half buried in the sandbed. But it pulsed, not with light but with language. Low-frequency EM signals, irregular and old, at least 700 cycles by Council dating standards. The signal was faint, barely a whisper encoded in harmonics no standard transceiver should have caught. But Cale wasn't using standard tools. His visor was repurposed, a spliced hybrid of old Sentinel optics and customized feedback channels. What he heard was unmistakable, an interlaced broadcast loop in triadic resonance. Thelyri code. Unmistakable. Thelyri, a species long thought extinct or, worse, mythologized. Adaptive lightbenders, some said. Daywalkers that turned invisible in full sun. Others claimed they were archivists of a kind, storing history in refracted patterns rather than writing. Their worlds had vanished during the expansion conflict, supposedly cleansed for civilizational harmonization. No official record remained, only rumors. And now a pillar whispering in patterns no human tongue could form. Cale knelt before the spire. On its base he traced shallow grooves, fractal intersecting. Not language, not exactly. More like mnemonic filaments designed to catch light in precise angles. When his gloved hand passed over one, the air shivered. And that's when he saw it, the reflection. Not his own, someone else. A silhouette, tall, luminous, barely perceptible against the curvature of the quartz. It flickered, then was gone. But Cale's heart pounded, not with fear, with recognition. This wasn't debris. This was a beacon, a memory tower, a relic of a people who recorded truth, not in matter, but in light. And if they still had the power to project across time, maybe they hadn't all vanished. Maybe someone or something had stayed behind to watch the watchers. He stood in silence for a long time. The wind tugged at the edge of his coat like fingers, uncertain if they should hold on or let go. Behind him, the sky bled into 9 overlapping suns. Ahead, the pillar pulsed again, slower now, as if it had acknowledged him. Kyle wasn't ready to name what he felt, but for the first time in cycles, he didn't feel alone, and that in a place designed to erase was something dangerously close to hope. The signal led Kyle across 3 fractured valleys and a canyon known only by the way its light folded inward. The locals, what few remained in exile here, called it the Mouth of Echoes. But to Kale, it was geometry made feral. Towers of crystalline basalt jutted like broken ribs from the floor, reflecting stray beams in odd loops that seemed to illuminate nothing and everything at once. It was there, cradled between opposing cliffs, that Kale first laid eyes on it. The Mirror Spire. At first it looked like nothing more than an obelisk of translucent mineral. Tall, narrowing to a sharp apex, its surface shimmered, not with light but memory. Not in the way a lens bends vision, but in how a scar reshapes skin. As Kale approached, his boots grinding against the obsidian grit, the tower reacted. Not kinetically, not thermally. It hummed. He blinked. In the surface of the spire, he saw a child. Know himself younger, maybe 9. Crying. Alone on a cold observation deck aboard the Daedalus orbit cruiser. The memory twisted in the quartzine shell of the spire and vanished like smoke. Cal took 2 steps back. This wasn't just a monument, it was an interface. The Mirror Spire was constructed from a substance that had no analog in council databases. It resembled silicate fused with photonic filament clusters, responsive to incident light. Not just passive reflection, active memory translation. Like a mind made of prisms. And more curiously, it only responded under direct stellar exposure, specifically from Arctix's second sun, Velcentra b. Cal theorized the spire required a precise spectrum to activate, perhaps because memories were encoded not in the material itself, but in the light that touched it. Not just visual memory, but emotional context intent. It didn't show you what you wanted to see, it showed what you tried to forget. The closer he got, the more persistent the reactions. Old faces, scars he didn't recall earning, orders he didn't remember giving. The light brought them all forth raw and unedited. Who had built such a thing? His mind turned inevitably to the Thaleri, a vanished people with no artifacts, no tombs, only rumors, and now this. If the spire wasn't theirs, it was at least built for their kind. The reflective feedback mechanism was too precise, too responsive to emotional wavelength. It wasn't human, and no known AI had ever demonstrated this kind of interpretive memory decoding. Kyle circled the tower cautious. The wind shifted, and then he wasn't alone. The air behind him shivered. Not a sound, not a footfall, just a slight disagreement in the way shadow behaved. And then a flicker blue, impossibly soft like moonlight, spilled across liquid mercury. She stood not 2 meters behind him, tall, lean, skin that shimmered with refracted hues, shifting with the angle of light, not as camouflage, but as presence. Her eyes were like obsidian wet with starlight, and her hair fell like strands of liquefied aurora. She wore no armor, no insignia, only a robe of refractive fiber cloaking her form in fluid iridescence. Kyle's first reaction was instinct. He reached for the phase pistol at his hip. She didn't move. He hesitated. The air between them was silent, charged. Then she spoke, not in any known tongue, but in refraction. Her voice was light, quite literally. The angle of her words refracted off the spire and resonated in Kale's inner ear like memories echoing backward. And then she simply said aloud and in perfect interlingua, "You came to remember." Her name, though she did not offer it immediately, was Zirela. She didn't attack. She didn't run. She watched him as if he were an echo trying to resolve itself. And Cal, against all better judgment, lowered his weapon. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I came because something called me." Zirela tilted her head slightly like a biologist studying a specimen that had unexpectedly spoken. "You carry pieces," she said. "Some yours, some borrowed. None whole." It wasn't a question. Cal swallowed. "You can see them." She stepped closer, her iridescent form flickering between spectra. As her fingertips touched the spire, a wave of light pulsed outward, and a vision burst forth, a younger Kyle leading a breach squad through a collapsing habitat dome. Screams, muzzles flaring. Then the image fractured, dissipated into static. Zyrella closed her eyes. This one bleeds when lit. She was reading him not through touch, but through reflected light. Her species biology, Kel would later learn, was adapted not for hiding, but translating. Their epidermis refracted external light into patterns that could interact with memory substrates. Light filtered through Zyrella became understanding. And yet she hadn't struck him down. Hadn't judged. Not yet. "Why aren't you angry?" he asked. Her voice dropped lower, almost mechanical in its detachment. "I have been angry, for cycles uncounted. Anger dried. Curiosity remained." That was when he realized she wasn't here by chance. She was stationed here, watching, waiting, for him. The next hours passed in quiet exchange. Kel recounted the signals, the visions, the missing gaps in his mind. Zarella listened, unmoving, only her pulse visible, as shifting ripples of blue along her temples gave any sign of thought. He wanted answers, wanted truth, but she did not offer it freely, not yet. She wanted to know him. "What do you believe happened to you?" she asked. Kyle hesitated. "I think I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. On Varun. I think they made me forget." "Who is they?" "The council." Zarella nodded slowly. "And if your memory lies, would you trust what you recover, knowing it might not be yours?" He paused. "Even if it's painful, I need to know what was taken." Zarella turned toward the spire, placed both hands against its surface. The mirror spire responded instantly, fractals of color coiling outward. "I can show you," she said, "but it will not be gentle." Cal stepped forward. He thought of all the dreams that ended in screams, all the waking hours lost to silence and dread. "I don't need gentle," he said. She met his gaze, and for a moment he saw something breakable behind her calm. "Then we begin." He extended his hand. She took it. The contact was electric, not pain, not sensation, but flood. A torrent of images. Screaming civilians. His own voice hoarse with command. An order given, not understood. A child crumpling beneath a flash of light, and Cal standing over them, weapon drawn. His voice cracked. I didn't." The spire twisted the memory again. Not what happened. What was remembered. He staggered back. "That's not how I remember it." Zarella's eyes narrowed. "It is how it was. What you recall is what they left you." Cal's legs buckled. He knelt. The truth was worse than any fiction he'd imagined. Zarella placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is the price." "You asked to see." "I didn't know," he gasped. "No," she said quietly. "But now you cannot unsee it." The reflection came with no warning. Cal had barely closed his eyes before the light from the mirror spire bent inward, twisted through Zarella's palms, and slammed into his consciousness like a floodgate bursting. There was no transition, no gentle onset. One moment he stood in the canyon shadow, and the next he was back on Varun. His visor flared with tactical overlays. His voice echoed in his own ears, issuing orders he didn't remember giving. The thrum of his squad's pulse rifles, the crunch of boots on ash, it was all so immediate. So real. But it wasn't the version from Council records. The official mission report, the one Cale had read over and over after his court-martial, described a breach and secure operation on an illegal insurgent biofacility. A controlled engagement. Low resistance. No civilian presence. No survivors. But what the mirror spire showed him was chaos. Screams. Children fleeing down corridors of fractal glass. Organic structures collapsing under plasma fire. And Cale, in the lead issuing fire commands as a language he didn't understand, rang out behind the walls. He wasn't fighting insurgents. He was leading a purge. What is this?" he gasped, stumbling back, eyes wide with horror. Zarella stood still, her voice quiet and heavy. "Memory. Yours, unmasked." He shook his head violently. No, this isn't what happened. I would have never." "You did," she said without judgment, "but not as you are." Cal's stomach churned. His hands trembled. He looked down and saw them stain the ghost of old blood, reappearing under the spire's reflection. The truth was cruel in its simplicity. Kale hadn't been just a soldier following orders. He'd been the instrument, the blunt edge the council used to strike through ambiguity. His role wasn't to question, it was to erase. And they made sure he forgot it. The memory block was deep, not just cortical, but emotional. Layered suppression reinforced by synthetic trauma triggers. Every time he'd gotten close to remembering, his mind had recoiled, painting over the truth with numbness and manufactured doubt. But here under the spire, under Zarela's silent gaze, the lies had nowhere to hide. He collapsed to one knee, gasping, I didn't know what we were doing." Zarela's expression didn't change, but the glow along her skin shifted, a deeper hue of violet, now harder, colder. "And if you had known," Kale hesitated. The silence answered for him. The species they'd eradicated on Varun were not insurgents. They weren't even armed. Slender, luminous beings with skin that shimmered like liquid crystal. Their eyes too wide. Their limbs too delicate. They ran, not fought. Kyle had seen one try to shield a child. A moment later, they'd both been vaporized. Thaleri, Kyle whispered. Zarela nodded once. "A shard of them, yes. One of our last uncontacted enclaves, hiding in curvature valleys beyond council site." "But why," he said, struggling to his feet. "Why would the council do this? You weren't a threat." "Not yet," she said. "But we remembered too much, and we refused to forget." The weight of it struck Kale like gravity returned. The council hadn't feared the Thaleri's weapons, they'd feared their memory. Their ability to reflect record and retain the truth, even when every other civilization bowed to revision. That made them dangerous. And Kyle, or the version of him that existed then, had pulled the trigger. He clutched his head. "I didn't want this. I didn't choose this." "But you didn't resist either," Zarela said, her tone sharper now. "You were their hand, and you let yourself be shaped." Kyle couldn't argue. There was no defense strong enough. Yet Zarela did not leave. She could have. Her species had vanished from galactic maps for lesser slights. Retaliation was a Thaleri principle, the restoration of balance through reversal. And yet she stood there, watching. "Why are you still here?" he asked, broken. Zarela stepped forward close enough that the spire's glow bounced between them. "Because I needed to see," she said, "if guilt was all you had left." Kale met her eyes, and her face softened barely. "You have questions, not excuses. Is that enough?" "No," she said, "but it's a beginning." Silence hung between them, again long and wide as space. She turned to the spire. "You carry fragments, pieces too jagged to fit. I wanted to see if you'd bleed trying to reassemble them or bury them deeper." Kyle wiped his face with the back of his glove, and now Zarela let her fingers rest against the surface of the tower. "Now," she said, "you decide if you want to know the rest." There was a moment just before it began when Kale thought he had finally stabilized. After days, or perhaps only hours, of confronting twisted recollections, guilt-laced truths, and Zarela's piercing assessments, he believed he'd reached the core of his fragmented past. He was wrong. The mirror spire had never offered linearity, but now it began to fracture his memories in a new way, not by revealing what had been hidden, but by colliding multiple versions of the same moment. Each step toward the spire was like stepping into a different history of himself. He saw himself on Varun again, but this time not leading the charge, not holding a rifle. He was refusing. Standing before a council envoy, his face bruised, eyes defiant. "I won't authorize a strike on a civilian enclave," he heard himself say. Then it was gone. Another Kale stepped into the scene, weapon in hand, eyes cold, efficient. The same hallway, the same blood, different choices. "What the hell is happening to me?" he asked aloud, staggering away from the tower. Zarela stood nearby, her gaze tracking him without blinking. "You're reaching the convergence," she said calmly. "The point where too many timelines blur into one." Kale blinked. "What do you mean, timelines here on Arctics?" she explained. "Light doesn't just illuminate. It dislocates. When it passes through certain curvature pockets like the ones surrounding the mirror spire, it slows, refracts, folds. And memory, especially memory engraved by light, doesn't obey the same laws in such a place. You're saying the planet's physics are corrupting my memories, Nozarela said. I'm saying your memories were never whole to begin with. The planet merely reveals the collisions. Kyle stared at his hands. He'd begun to feel it too, the bleed. Images from different lives brushing against each other, unresolved. In one memory, he was arguing with a superior officer. In another, accepting the same order in silence. A third showed him alone, weeping after the bombardment. A fourth blank void of context, just smoke and static. What if I never said no? He whispered. Zarella stepped closer, the air around her shimmering. Or what if you did? And they rewrote you? The question gutted him. There was a moment fleeting but sharp in the newest memory resurfacing, a dark council chamber. 6 silhouettes standing in crescent. The room pulsed with artificial gravity, a form of psychological pressure. You are authorized to initiate Protocol Horizon, one of them intoned. Kyle the past. Kyle stood silent, his fist clenched. No, he said. Just that. No. They're civilians. You've got no evidence of insurgent influence. This is not a vote, Agent Draven. I'm not your executioner. That version of him never made it to official records. In the next instant, the memory distorted like static, crawling across a damaged holofeed. The faces of the council blurred, their voices layered over each other in a cacophony of edits. Then abruptly, the scene ended. Kale opened his eyes, gasping. His pulse spiked. I did resist, he said, his voice hollow. I said no. Zarela didn't respond immediately. She moved toward the mirror spire, her fingers brushing along its surface, as though feeling for an answer in its temperature. If that was true, she finally said, why did it disappear? Kale clenched his jaw. Because it didn't serve their narrative. Because showing resistance might have inspired others. And yet, she said quietly, you forgot it too. Not just because they wiped it, but because you let them. Her words stung deeper than accusation. They felt like loss. He wanted to argue, but a darker question lingered in his mind. What if this newly recovered memory, the one where he resisted, wasn't even real? What if it was just a psychological buffer, a false comfort constructed by a mind desperate to believe it had once been moral? Zarela seemed to read the doubt before he voiced it. You don't trust what you remember, she said. How can I? He shot back. Every layer I peel away shows another contradiction. How do I know which version of me is true? You don't, she said. That's the paradox. You're trapped between what you want to remember and what you were made to forget. Kale sank to the ground, arms resting on his knees. So what's the point? If I can't trust even the memories I think I recovered, Zarela's voice was calm but distant. Memory is not truth. It is reflection. It can be distorted, but it reveals what the mind prioritizes. He looked up at her, and for the first time there was something vulnerable in his eyes. What do you see in me then? A murderer pretending to have a conscience, or a soldier trying to salvage something human? Zarela didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was distant, not cold, but cautious. I see contradiction, she said softly. I see someone who wants to be more than what he was told to be. But I also see a man afraid of finding out that maybe he never was. Cal felt something break inside, a pressure he hadn't named before now. He realized that all this time, even through guilt and dread, he had been hoping to find proof he had once been good. Some memory that would absolve him, but what he found was ambiguity. And ambiguity doesn't offer absolution, only responsibility. I can't undo what I did, he said. But maybe I can choose who I become now. Zarela nodded. Then that is what I needed to see. He blinked. See for what? But she said nothing more. She walked away from the mirror spire, her silhouette dissolving briefly in a ray of sunset light, fractured by the canyon's curvature. Kyle watched her heart-heavy thoughts spinning. Somewhere deep within the spire, his past continued to shimmer, not fixed, not whole, but waiting. Maybe the truth wasn't in one version of memory. Maybe it was in the space between them, the tension, the choice. And Kyle was ready to choose. The light was softer that day. It filtered through the upper ridges of Arctic's canyon walls like a forgotten lullaby, diffused by dust and memory. Cal approached the mirror spire with the same reverence one might approach an open casket. Heart-braced breath, shallow, ready to face something unchangeable. He had asked Zarela for everything, the worst of it, Not just fragments, not curated glimpses. He wanted to see the memory that had been sealed beyond all others, the one that hurt too much to survive unfiltered. Cyrilla had been silent at first. Then with deliberate weight, she stepped toward the spire and placed her palms against its surface. No words, no dramatic flourish, just her body and the glass forming a circuit of light and pain. The mirror spire bloomed. Kale felt the pressure in his skull shift like a door unlocking without his consent. A scream unvoiced clawed through his spine, and then he saw it. Not metaphor, not allegory, the event. He stood in a chamber he didn't recognize, circular, sterile, lined with concentric holographic glyphs. At its center hovered an orb of pulsing green fluid, rotating slowly above an isolation field. Every few seconds, a pulse of violet shimmer rippled outward from it, time-distorting radiation. Living entropy. Project designation. Silence. He heard voices. The councils. Subject secured. Target population estimate 2.1 million sentients. Deployment vector confirmed. And then a final command, Agent Kale Draven. Initiate release. Kale, younger, expressionless, stepped forward. He placed his hand on the activation node. It accepted his biosignature. There was no dramatic flourish, no explosion, just a click. The orb pulsed once, then dissolved into mist. Cut to the next scene. Orbit. Satellite images of an entire region. Green lush populated with glimmering cities descending into necrosis. Buildings collapsing, flora blackening, bodies, millions. And Kale, the man now, watching this in horror, staggered back from the spire, dry heaving hands trembling. He was the executioner, the trigger, not part of the team, the only one authorized to activate the payload. Why me, he whispered, voice cracking. Zyrella's voice came from behind. Because you were perfect, efficient, loyal, and disposable. Cal looked at her. They didn't even give me context. No, she said quietly. You were given procedure. That was all they needed. He clutched his head. Did I even hesitate? The spire offered no such kindness. No, he hadn't. His expression in the memory had been empty, professional, cold. But that wasn't me, Kale muttered. That can't have been me. There's more, Zarela said. Her voice was different now. Not detached, not superior, but wounded. She stepped forward, eyes catching the fractured reflections of the spire. They gave me a memory, too. Kale blinked, stunned. What? She closed her eyes. I always believed you did it. Not as soldier, not as pawn, but as monster. I was made to believe you enjoyed it. Kale's throat tightened. But you just saw. She shook her head. That wasn't what I saw for years. My memory, the one they implanted, showed you smiling as the payload dispersed, walking away as my people died. Kale looked horrified. You saw that I lived it, over and over, for 50 cycles. Who? He whispered. Who gave you that memory, the council? The same ones who erased you. They wanted me to hate you, to hunt you. Kyle felt the canyon spin around him. Everything collapsed into betrayal. Why, he asked. Why manipulate both of us? To test you, Zarela said bitterly. And to test me. The silence between them was dense, not empty, filled with implications too large to voice. They had both been pawns, tools in a psychological experiment orchestrated by minds that valued narrative more than lives. Cal broke the silence first. If they implanted false memories in you, and in me, how do we know any of this is real? Zarela stepped toward the spire. We don't. Then why trust any of it? Because even if the memory is a lie, she said softly, the emotion it causes is not. Cal considered that. He wasn't sure if it was comforting or damning. Maybe they never wanted truth, he said, just to see what we would do when our realities collapsed. Zarela nodded. If we'd kill each other, or trust each other. Kale exhaled. So what are we now, a data set in a moral experiment? She didn't answer. Instead, she held out her hand. Kale stared at it. What is this? He asked. A choice, she said. Not between lies and truth, but between fear and something else. He hesitated. If I take your hand, I'm trusting that none of this is another manipulation. She nodded. and I'm trusting you not to become the man they told me you were." Their hands met. The contact was tentative, trembling, but real. "I don't know who I am anymore," Kyle whispered. Zarella's voice was barely audible. "Neither do I. But maybe, together, we can find out who we're not." For the first time in cycles, Kale didn't feel like a ghost. They both turned to the mirror spire. Its surface shimmered not in chaos, not in contradiction, but in unity, as if it too acknowledged that between falsehood and truth intention still mattered. And maybe in a world where memories could be rewritten, the only real rebellion left was choice. There is a particular kind of silence that follows revelation, not the hush of awe, nor the void of disbelief, but the deep strangled quiet of recognition. Cal stood before the mirror spire as light cascaded down its fractured facets, bleeding through him like filtered regret. He had asked for the whole truth. The spire had granted it. He had once been its master, not a visitor, not a victim, a designer. The mirror spire, or rather the broader initiative known as Project Mirror, was never merely a monument. It was a fragment of a galactic architecture of memory, a vast network of crystalline spires seated across fringe worlds, all connected through quantum light relays that use solar refraction to scan, store, and alter memory patterns across species. The Council had envisioned it as the final weapon of Dominion control, not over people, but over what they believed had happened. Entire planetary histories were reshaped in minutes. Uprisings dissolved retroactively, treaties rewritten, witnesses forgotten, and Cale Draven, once the cold tactician, had overseen this web of lies. As chief supervisor of Phase 2 encoding, he had the authority to validate or delete any record. He hadn't simply executed orders, he'd curated them. The memory struck like a slow-burning infection, not with a scream, but with a whisper. Kyle, standing in a sterile vault, rows of crystal lattice towers humming in a steady rhythm, flickering with 1,000,000,000,000 lifetimes. He was speaking to a team of bioempathic engineers, issuing precise commands to isolate dissident histories and inject synthetic causal threads. A young woman asked him then, "Sir, what if someone remembers differently?" Cale's answer had been terrifyingly simple. "Then they become unstable, and instability is self-correcting." That had been him. Cold, clinical, convinced of necessity. But something changed. Another memory bled through this one, fractured, more chaotic. Kale standing over a control node, fingers trembling, face pale. Surveillance logs playing on a screen, children crying, a rewritten city collapsing into madness after a false plague protocol was deployed. Then, a voice, not one from the Council, a soft one. Her voice, Zyrella. He remembered it now, not this Zyrella, but another instance, another lifetime. A transmission intercepted from the Thaleri home clusters. She had spoken of memory as sacred, of history as a species right. Her words had cracked something in him long before he ever met her in person. Guilt didn't wake him. Doubt did. And that doubt had grown until he did the unthinkable. He turned against the system he had helped create. The process of erasure had to be perfect. Kyle couldn't just disappear. He had to never exist in the network. He had embedded backdoors into the Guang codebase early on, failsafes in case any node was compromised. Using those, he initiated a recursive memory collapse, erasing every trace of his own presence from the distributed lattice. But to fully sever himself, he needed assistance. He remembered a face, Seren Malix, an empathic archivist whose loyalty was fractured, but whose genius was undeniable. She had once whispered, "Even light can lie if it reflects the wrong angle." She helped him disappear, risking execution. Her fate after that, Cal still did not know. "Why did I do it?" he muttered aloud. Zarella stood beside him, now silent for a long time. "Because you realized the truth," she finally said. "You weren't erasing the past. You were murdering futures." Cal looked at her. "And what's left of me now, a hollow man who once destroyed the world and then deleted himself from it." "You were not hollow," she said, her voice unusually soft. "You were a mirror cracked enough to see its own flaw." He didn't know whether to thank her or flinch from it. And then she stepped back, her expression shifting, and Cale sensed it. The subtle tension. The weight she had been carrying since they met. It shifted forward now like a blade being unsheathed slowly. "I need to tell you something," she said. His body went still. "I wasn't sent here to find the truth," she continued. "I was sent to test you." Cal narrowed his eyes. "Test me." Zyrilla nodded once. "I'm not a survivor of the Thaleri. Was an operative, planted by the Council, embedded with false memories, calibrated to draw you out." Cal took a step back. "You're saying this whole time?" "Yes," she said, her voice hollow. "I was created to provoke you, to make you remember, to see if guilt or obedience would win." He stared at her in silence. The betrayal didn't sting like he expected. It throbbed deeper like déjà vu tasting of ash. And now he asked, "Are you still reporting back?" Zyrella's gaze faltered. "I cut the link 3 cycles ago," she said, "when I saw the real memory, when I realized they'd made me a lie, to destroy the truth." Cal didn't speak. He simply turned away, face unreadable. "I didn't choose my assignment," she said, "but I chose what I did with it." He breathed slowly. "And what did the Council want in the end?" "What was I to them?" Zarella hesitated. "Then they wanted to know if Erasure could be absolute, if even the architect could be turned into the artifact." Kale closed his eyes. "And what was your conclusion?" Zarella stepped closer. "You weren't erased," she said. "You became something they couldn't predict." "A variable," Kale muttered. "No," she corrected. "A memory that resisted rewriting." He turned to face her again. "And now what, Zyrella? We've both been used, both rewritten. What's left to trust?" She met his gaze. Not memory, but choice. They stood in silence. Then slowly Kale extended his hand, not in forgiveness, not in reconciliation. Just in shared recognition. She took it. The mirror spire pulsed once. And for a moment, neither of them were operatives or fugitives or reflections of something broken. They were simply people, a warden, a spy, bound by betrayal but free to choose what came next. The sky broke in layers. It wasn't a storm in the traditional sense. No thunder, no wind, no rain. Instead, the firmament above Arctics twisted like glass under strain, splitting into bands of distorted chroma, each layer bleeding into the next, bending time with every pulse of charged light. The mirror spire began to hum erratically. Cal turned to Zarella. "Is it happening?" he asked. She was already scanning the horizon. "Yes, a temporal compression spiral. The sun's polarity has inverted. This region is collapsing into asynchronous entropy. In simpler terms, time was breaking. They didn't have long. The canyons that once echoed with memory now warped in shape and sequence. Stone cracked in reverse. Plants aged forward. Footsteps appeared before they were made. Kale felt his breath stumble, mid-inhale, a fragment of yesterday catching in his lungs. His arm flickered between moments, glitching like corrupted data. "We need to leave," he said, grabbing Zarella's shoulder, but she didn't move. "We can't," she said flatly. "We're already inside." The mirror spire trembled behind them. Not physically, temporally. Its refraction patterns had split, scattering beams of partial memory across dozens of timeline currents. They had stepped too close during the inversion. The spire designed to read and record light-born memory had become a prism of misaligned realities. In short, they were trapped in a temporal rift. A non-linear fold, Zarella explained, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Time here no longer progresses in a single direction. The moment you step past that ridge, you existed in all versions of now, and none." Cal looked around. The canyon was a blur of contradictions. He saw versions of himself standing still, running, bleeding, and vanishing all at once. "How do we get out?" he asked, pulse racing. "You don't escape a fold," she said. "You anchor through it. And how do we do that? Memory, of course." It was always memory. "Unstable timelines collapse unless they attach to something fixed," Zarella continued. "A constant, a core narrative. If we embed a version of ourselves deeply enough into the mirror spire, we become that constant." Kale's brow furrowed. "You want to use the spire as a beacon?" "No," she said. "As a keystone. But the process wouldn't be simple. In the rift, their minds weren't just vulnerable, they were porous. Every passing moment threatened to overwrite a piece of themselves. Emotions not their own surged in waves. Kale suddenly remembered holding a daughter he never had. Zirella blinked and saw herself watching Kale die, though he was beside her. Zirella, he gasped. What happens if we stay too long? You become nothing, she said, or too many things. Your mind fragments. Your identity collapses. Kyle gritted his teeth. Then let's anchor now. But Zirella hesitated. I need to go first, she said. What she took a breath, then whispered. This will be my first act outside of the council's orders. Kyle's heart slowed. You're saying everything until now. I was programmed, she said. Even my guilt, my doubts, they were parameters. Then why are you helping me now? She turned to face him fully. Because parameters break, and trust can grow inside the cracks. The words hung between them, too fragile to breathe on. I'll start the encoding sequence, she said. Once I begin, you must follow. You'll only have one window, and it will cost you. Cost me what everything you remember. Kyle swallowed hard. Then what's left? Zirella stepped forward, pressing her palm to the spire's core facet. It flared with fractured light, not from the sun, but from her own refracted biology. Her body shimmered, shifting into patterns of thought and rhythm, feeding her story into the machine. I'll go first, she said again. Not because I'm the better one, but because you need to see that I'm not lying. He watched her memories surge into the mirror spire, raw, unfiltered, chaotic. A childhood in shadow, training camps with no mirrors. The moment she was told her name was not hers. The first time she saw Kale's profile on a council slate. The rage, the doubt, the silent rebellion. Cal stepped forward, eyes stinging. Zirella, this could kill you. She nodded. Then let it be my choice. She reached out. He took her hand. They stood together, light erupting around them as the spire absorbed their shared intent. Now it was his turn. Kale stepped into the beam, heart hammering, and he let go. He gave the spire everything. His first deployment. His first lie. The quiet disgust in his throat when he watched a civilian settlement wiped clean from record. His resistance. His shame. The face of the girl he had seen die on Varun, the one he hadn't saved. The version of himself that said no, and the one who obeyed. He let it all flood in, not to forgive, not to forget, but to preserve. The mirror spire pulsed wildly, threads of memory anchoring across the rift. Reality shuddered once, twice, then settled like a knot pulled tight. Cal gasped and fell to his knees. The world stopped flickering. Did it work? He rasped. Zirella opened her eyes. Yes, the spire holds, the fold is closing, but time was not their only enemy. I can't keep everything he said. It's slipping. She moved toward him. We anchored it. But we'll have to pay. Cal looked up. How much? Zirella stared at him with a sorrow that could only be earned. If we're to escape the rift, you must forget. He understood instantly. The price of stabilizing the spire was the forfeiture of personal continuity. One of them had to be the clean slate, the unweighted constant, and it had to be him. Zirella had already committed her truth. She would carry it. He would vanish from himself. Cal nodded slowly. Then remember for me. Her voice cracked. I will. They stood there forehead to forehead as the spire drank the last of his history. He smiled, the edges of himself already dissolving. I'm not afraid, he whispered. Then that, Zirella said, is your real memory. The storm collapsed around them. The fold sealed, and Cal Draven forgot his name. The mirror spire had grown still. It no longer shimmered with kaleidoscopic turbulence, nor pulsed with erratic energy. Instead, it stood calm like a sentient being, waiting for a vow to be spoken. Kyle Draven stood before it with the posture of a man about to die, though his heart still beat steadily in his chest. Zirella watched him from the shadow of a fractured cliff. Her arms were folded, but her expression had no distance, no detachment. What they were about to do was beyond protocol, beyond rebellion. It was something personal and perhaps irreversible. The Guang requires sacrifice, she said, voice softened by the low wind. It does not accept fragmented truth. It needs coherence, continuity, wholeness. Cal nodded slowly, not looking at her. And to give it that, I have to give it me. He wasn't wrong. The mirror spire, as they had discovered, was not a passive storage unit. It was a mnemonic prism, one that did not simply collect information, but transcribed consciousness through a process known to the Theleri as resonant imprinting. The recorder, to encode memory at its truest fidelity, had to offer a complete mental state, unbroken, uncloaked, unfiltered. In exchange, the spire would mirror that life in crystalline permanence, etching each memory into photonic resonance that could persist for millennia, possibly longer. But this permanence came with a price, a paradox. Because the spire required the memory to be free of recursion, the host could not continue holding those memories once they were embedded. It was like pouring a soul into glass the vessel would fill, but the hand that held it would be left empty. The spire demanded Kale's identity in total, not just his memories of action or fact, but his attachments, his doubts, his joy, his rage, his forgiveness. To record them honestly, he would have to forget them completely. Zarella said nothing for a long while after explaining this. Her breath caught when Kale asked, "Can I keep even a piece of it a name?" A thought her eyes had softened, but her answer was unflinching. "If you do the Guang fractures," she said, "your truth will be incomplete, distorted. The encoded memory could decay or worse, rewrite itself." Kyle stared at his hands. They were steady, but his voice trembled. "Then there's no middle ground." "No," she whispered. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. The choice remained his. Zarela would not make it for him. He asked her half seriously, half pleading, "Couldn't you help me hold on to something, just one tether? Use your refraction trick. Store a single shard of me within you." Zarela's answer was almost inaudible. "If I did that, I would destroy the reflection. The Guang wouldn't recognize the echo. It would collapse. And the council, they would notice," she said, "and kill me for it." Silence stretched between them, heavy and mournful. Kale looked back at the mirror spire. It stood patiently glowing faintly as the last light of Arctix's fractal dusk settled across the canyon walls. In that moment, Kale imagined what it would feel like to forget everything, to wake up without a past, without context, to see Zarela and not know her face, not know why he trusted her. "Would I be empty?" he asked. "No," she said, "just new." That thought frightened him more than death. Still, he hesitated. For hours, perhaps more, Kale paced. He asked questions. He revisited memories that already trembled at the edges of his mind, moments he had fought so hard to reclaim the child on Varun, the first day in the council's training compound, the sound of his mother's breath as she sang an old earth lullaby. Each of them slipped further away the closer he got to the spire. But one memory, recent, soft, clung stubbornly. Zarela's voice speaking not as an agent, not as a test, but as a companion. Even if the memory's gone, the truth still leaves a shadow. It wasn't science, it was faith, and it was hers. That was when he made his choice. Cal stepped toward the spire, the surface warping gently as it sensed his presence. Zarela moved beside him but kept her distance. She couldn't interfere, but she could witness. And she would. "I'm ready," Kale said. But before beginning the sequence, he turned slightly, gaze not quite meeting hers. He whispered something not to her, not to the spire, but to himself. 3 soft syllables spoken in a cadence that mimicked the rhythms of an old military transmission. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a code. It was a question uttered in the form of a memory riddle. Zarela heard it, and when she did, her skin flared softly, light bending across her form in synchronized waves. She understood immediately. It was a seed, a mnemonic cipher, a phrase that, if replayed under exact emotional and photonic resonance, could awaken a trace pattern. Not a full recovery, but perhaps a glimmer, a door. Cal pressed both hands to the Guang. The interface activated instantly. The entire structure surged with light, every fracture, every facet, glowing with the full spectrum of Kale's mind. Memories poured out, messy, vivid, human. Pain and power, guilt and grace, his first kill, his first laugh after exile, the feeling of Zarela's hand on his chest as the storm collapsed, all of it given freely. Then silence. Kyle's body slumped. Zarela caught him. He was breathing, heart steady, but his eyes were blank, not in terror, not in peace, just absence. He blinked slowly, looking around without recognition. Who? He whispered. It's okay, Zarella murmured. You don't need to remember. I do. She laid him gently at the base of the spire. Around them, the encoded memories continued to dance, etched into light, silent yet eternal. Later, as the sky darkened and no one came, Zarella stood alone, touching the place on the spire where Cal had whispered his final cipher. The ripple still moved beneath the surface. A dormant echo, waiting. She whispered it back. Not aloud, but into her own neural interface, into her own reflection. One day, if the time was right, if Cale's body remembered what his mind had lost, this phrase might guide him home. Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps it was nothing more than a poetic indulgence. But maybe, just maybe, Cale had not chosen oblivion. Maybe he had chosen hope. The process was not instant. Memory, unlike data, did not leave the mind in clean files or organized lines. It resisted extraction. It wept and screamed and clawed at the edges of the psyche as it was pulled free. For Cale Draven, this final surrender was not performed in silence. It was a quiet war waged within the chambers of his own soul. It began with faces. They vanished in reverse order, not chronologically, but emotionally. The people he'd tried hardest to hold on to were the first to go. A comrade from the early days. A child's eyes on Varun. His mother's smile, no name, just warmth. Then came Zarella's face, though not all at once. It fractured. Her eyes went first, then her voice, and finally her name, leaving behind only a sense of soft light and aching gravity. As each memory dissolved, it took with it a piece of feeling regret, affection, resistance. At first, Cale gasped, grasping at air, as if trying to hold on to something not yet gone. His muscles trembled, his pupils flickered as if searching for things no longer present. Then one by one, the emotions flattened, like canvas stretched too tight, snapping soundlessly. The pain wasn't physical, not entirely, but it wasn't painless either. It was a kind of unmaking, a slow erosion of self, layer after layer of meaning, reduced to sensory ghosting. It left Kyle not in agony, but in absence. A gentle kind of annihilation, like drowning in warm water only to forget what breathing meant in the first place. Zarella stood at the edge of the mirror spire, watching, unmoving. She didn't speak. She didn't intervene. Her hands trembled once briefly, but her expression was steel. She was not just a witness to Cale's unraveling, she was its guardian, its mourner, the only one who would remember that this had ever happened at all. Then the light began to break. The mirror spire flared with a brilliance not seen in cycles. Its core burst into motion, firing threads of color through every surface, like living arteries of refracted memory. Each thread spun itself outward, becoming crystalline particles suspended in the air, each a shard of Cale's life. Millions of them. They hovered like stars in a gravitational hold suspended by the quantum logic of the spire itself. Each fragment was not just a visual record, but a synesthetic imprint, sensation, sound, even moral context etched into photonic resonance. Zarella moved through them carefully, reverently. Each shard contained more than just sight. They were living artifacts, each capable of expanding into full memory under the right conditions. But they were fragile, vulnerable. Are they safe? She whispered aloud. The mirror spire answered not with words, but with a harmonic tremor, a low-frequency thrum that pulsed beneath the ground. It was an affirmation, but not a guarantee. Zarella knew better. No archive, no matter how advanced, was invulnerable. The council would come eventually. They always did. If they learned of this spire's full capacity, they would dismantle it, or worse, rewrite it. That meant protection required more than concealment. It required encryption. She raised her hands, triggering the backup routine she had encoded in secret long ago, a nonlinear masking sequence layered into the spire's reflective substrate. Each of Cale's memory shards folded in on themselves, warping under an algorithm only she could unlock. The result was chaos to any outsider, reflections of light that showed nothing, coherent patterns, too inconsistent to track. But to Zarella, the code was beautiful, structured, intimate. Then came something unexpected. The spire pulsed again, deeper this time. Its surface rippled once like a sigh, and a series of symbols emerged across its base. Not Theleri, not council, something else. A name. Draven. It had remembered him. Zarella stepped closer. You know him. A faint shimmer traced the crystal's edges affirmation. In all her years interfacing with memory spires, she had never seen this. Most Guang constructs were passive, semi-sentient at best. But this felt like will, as if the spire itself understood what it had been asked to hold, as if it grieved for what had been given. She reached out to touch the glyph. Take care of him, she said softly. I can't. Behind her, Cal stirred. He was not in pain, not anymore. His breathing was steady, his body intact, but his posture was different, less like a man resting and more like one newly born. His eyes opened slowly, searching without context. He blinked against the light and raised one hand to his face, feeling it as though it belonged to someone else. Zyrilla approached him slowly. Kyle, she asked, knowing the name meant nothing now. He looked at her with curiosity, not recognition. Do you know where you are, she asked. He shook his head. Do you know me? Another pause. Then quietly, Zarilla's breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside him, searching his face for any trace of the man he had been. And then just for a heartbeat, something flickered. Not a thought, not a name. Just a feeling of warmth in his gaze when he looked at her. A faint crease at the corner of his mouth, like a smile long forgotten, but not quite lost. It wasn't memory. It was effect. The body even stripped of narrative retained emotional residue, the ghost of attachment without context. Neuroscientists called it implicit sentiment memory, a kind of muscle memory for the soul. It was in some ways more enduring than conscious thought. Zarella placed a hand gently on his shoulder. It's okay, she said. You don't need to know me. I know you. He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. His gaze lingered on hers a little longer than chance allowed. She smiled, not because she was hopeful, but because somewhere deep in the structures of Kale's now empty mind, something still resonated. And it was enough. For now. Zarella stood at the edge of the council's crystalline tribunal, her posture unwavering, her skin now tuned to a dull silver, a sign of emotional suppression, a trait honed through decades of infiltration. Behind her, the memory of Arctics in the mirror spire glowed faintly in her neural echo, but in front of her, 12 mirrored visages regarded her in silence. She spoke with precision. Subject Kale Draven was neutralized as projected. The mirror spire has been rendered inert. No residual data beyond the assigned parameter remains. No tremble, no hesitation. The high auditory, a voice with no face, responded through the intercom mist above her. You witnessed the cognitive collapse I did, she replied. Phase completion confirmed. Identity strip succeeded. No anomaly retained. It was a lie wrapped in a precise fraction of truth. Another counselor interrupted, then explained the active signal signature still echoing from the Arctic's node. It reflects non-standard decay. Zarella paused just long enough to sell the uncertainty. Temporal distortion interference. The mirror spire rests on a fracture vector signal. Persistence is common in those regions. That was technically correct. But what she did not say was that the spire was very much alive and now held the purest, most damning memory archive ever generated against the Council. There was a flicker of silence, then approval. You will be reassigned to archive clearance. Reward tier revised to 17 theta. Physical form permitted retention, the voice concluded. A reward and a warning. She bowed. But inside her secondary neural cache pulsed with encrypted heat. Hidden beneath an innocuous sensory feed in her hippocampal spine cluster, the entire archive of Kale's real memories had been copied. She had masked it beneath a decoy log, a fabricated dreamscape she claimed was a personal meditative script developed to manage field trauma. The Council had seen such things before. They wouldn't look twice. The risk was incalculable. The punishment, if caught, would be total identity overwrite she would cease to be. But still she kept it. Why? Because there was something in Kale's final act that echoed within her. That willingness to burn oneself for a truth no one might ever see. That absurd, painful, beautiful defiance. It was human. And for a being designed to reflect others, Zarella had never felt more herself than when watching him forget her name. She would study the memories in private when secure. She would learn the rhythms of his resistance, the tonal decay of his fears, the tremors before each moral choice. In time, she would reconstruct not just who he was, but who she had been while near him. That archive had become more than data. It had become meaning. But the council was not finished. Within 48 hours of her debrief, orders were issued: the complete annihilation of the Mirror Spire. Not a disassembly, not a repurposing, erasure. Why the haste? Because the council understood something Xyrila hadn't anticipated: that memory, when stored in light, could ripple backward. The Spire's presence was destabilizing time flow across Arctics. It had started interfering with peripheral temporal relays, folding minor events from alternate presence into localized anomalies. That posed a threat far greater than testimony. It threatened causality. Worse, the Spire had begun self-encoding, responding to stimuli beyond programmatic range. It had become not just a repository, but a being, a witness, and witnesses had to be silenced. A pulse bomb would be sent via orbital tether, silent, clean, erasing the temporal lattice of the Spire without damaging the surrounding surface geology. Nothing would be left. And once it was gone, time itself on Arctics would collapse back into linearity, fractured but stabilized. Xyrila received the directive on a silent file at midnight standard cycle. She did not respond. She did not resist. There was no protest to file. But she did return to her quarters, sealed the door, and pressed her hand to the wall, where the synthetic light pulsed like a heartbeat. She whispered nothing, because there was nothing to say. Returning to Arctics now would be suicide. The orbit was already watched the signal path quarantine, and her biotag would trigger immediate suspicion. The council never trusted completely, and she had spent too long proving she wasn't a liability to act as one now. But as she sat in the silence, the neural echo hummed softly in the back of her mind. One file, labeled in her own dialect in a code she hadn't spoken since childhood. A single phrase. What is remembered lives. Maybe she couldn't go back, but maybe, one day, someone else could. And maybe they would find the Spire's memory buried in timelight. And maybe they would ask who Kale Draven was. And maybe, just maybe, the light would answer. Arctics was unraveling. What began as subtle shimmer distortions at dawn had now become full collapses in light fidelity. Beams of sun fractured midair, scattering into geometric impossibilities, casting shadows where no object stood. Time, always strange here, had begun to convulse. Entire minutes vanished from perception, hours doubled back upon themselves. Memories evaporated mid-thought. They called it memory fog. The scientists of the early observation posts had named it that before their data fractured and their minds followed. But that label was insufficient. This wasn't fog, it was amnesia baked into the air, a topological corrosion of cognition itself. Thoughts became loops, names became syllables. Without anchors, reality peeled away from sequence. The planet was shedding coherence. And at the epicenter of this collapse, the region once known as the Mirror Spire Basin folded inward, becoming a sphere of perfect forgetfulness. No drone could record it. No transmission could cross it. Memory within that radius died at the speed of light. They called it the null halo. No known species had survived a direct encounter with it. The Thaleri avoided such zones with primal fear, their ancestral songs warning of the light that eats the name. Records suggested that a prior civilization had tried to inhabit the core. During a similar collapse, what remained were jagged echo structures in other timelines, corrupted glyphs and systems that referenced entities without identities. And yet, even as the halo of loss spread outward, the Mirror Spire still stood unchanged, unyielding, suspended in its cradle of stone and sunlight. Its surface reflected nothing, not stars, not sky, not the decay, just silence. And still it pulsed. Kale Draven, or the man who had once been Kale Draven, stood just outside the fringe of that null field, unaware of what had been taken from him. His gait was even, his eyes sharp, but behind them an absence. He could recall his name because it had been left for him engraved on the inner seam of his coat. But the rest of him was a hollow structure of reflexes. What was strange, however, was what remained. He walked a perimeter around the spire every sunrise, always exactly 7 times clockwise. No one had instructed him to. He cooked a protein broth at the same time every cycle, using mineral dust that only the Thaleri knew to soak first to reduce toxins. He would stop at random and touch his fingers to stone surfaces squinting into their reflections. Once he built a shelter only to burn it down the next day. These were not survival patterns. These were rituals. Memoryless men did not perform rituals. There were no others on the surface to see this, but orbit still had its watchers. Automated probes, Teleri scouts hiding in delay time loops, and one somewhere behind veil code and restricted broadcast channels was Zyrella. She watched from afar, forbidden from contact but unable to look away. Her neural array flagged Kale's behavior repeatedly as non-random. It cataloged his movements, cross-referenced with the archived emotional pulses she had stored tones of decision-making, moments of hesitation resistance. The patterns were familiar. But more than data, there was a feeling. He would pause sometimes and look at the sky, not in awe, not in fear, but with recognition, a kind of subconscious ache. His hand would twitch often toward the left side of his coat where nothing rested, as if he expected something to be there, as if it once had been. Zarela knew that emotion. It was the ghost of connection. He had no name for her, no memory of the hand she had once taken in her own, but she saw the shape of absence in his gaze. He missed something, and then came the signal. It was a flutter at first, buried deep within the residual static of the mirror spire's frequency drift, barely distinguishable from thermal noise. But Zarella had spent years reading the data heartbeats of shattered memory. She recognized a pattern. It repeated once every 47 minutes, a three-tone pulse, then silence, then an encrypted burst. When decrypted through the obsolete cipher Kyle had once used for covert field reports, it became a phrase, one she had only ever heard once before, whispered in a moment of fracture. "Find me again, where the light forgets." It was impossible. No biological structure could retain that message after the total purge protocol. No sentient entity should have been capable of leaving behind a post-forget marker without reflex triggers. But here it was, a neural breadcrumb, buried in the output reflection of the spire, carried by light, and it had her frequency tag encoded into it. The implication was staggering. Either Kyle had managed to retain a fragment of himself despite the memory annihilation protocol, or the mirror spire had preserved a seed of him so thoroughly that it now acted as a transmitter of intent. Was this what it meant for memory to achieve sentience? Was the spire no longer just a repository, but a vessel? Zyrela's mind spiraled. She had believed the sacrifice final, that what Kale had done was irreversible, that he had died not in body, but in mind. And yet some part of him had found a way to speak not in language, but in code. Not to everyone, just to her. She placed her hand on the receiver's crystalline surface, and for the first time since leaving Arctics, allowed herself to feel. Kale, she whispered the name like a stone in her throat. "You stubborn bastard," and the signal pulsed again. It was not a call for rescue. It was not a plea for recovery. It was an invitation to return, to witness, to believe. Perhaps he truly was gone. Perhaps what remained was only echo and programming. But perhaps not. Perhaps the mirror spire had not simply stored Kale's memories but become them. And in the heart of light where time died, where names were unmade, one signal repeated with unwavering persistence. "Find me again, where the light forgets." Zyrela stood in the chamber of still mirrors surrounded by 1,000 faces of herself, and none of them true. Each reflective arc showed her a slightly different past, different angles of choices made and left behind. Some carried traces of conviction, others shimmered with shame, but all carried the same core fracture, the decision not yet made. She had returned to Thalir Prime to fulfill protocol to complete the ceremonial audit of memory integrity as required by her classification. But time here felt thinner, less forgiving. Even the light in the Capitol domes was too precise, too clean. It cut through her thoughts, exposing what she tried to forget. Kyle's memory fragment pulsed in her synaptic archive like a splinter of warmth refusing to die. She should have purged it. Protocol demanded it. Her caste demanded it. Even the memory tamper logs showed mounting suspicion from council overseers. Her response delays her hesitation in terminating field traces, her refusal to let automated archival erase the last mission's tags. But she couldn't do it, because part of her still felt him, not just as an imprint, not just as a stored echo, but as a presence, dormant, flickering, incomplete, yet there. The decision lay before her like a blade across the chest. If she erased the fragment, she would be in full compliance. The council would not question further. Her rank would remain intact. She would ascend the diplomatic ladder and live without burden. But if she returned to Arctics, if she followed the signal, it meant acknowledging that belief held more power than memory. The risk was staggering. No vessel returned from Arctics' null halo without temporal fracturing. And to enter that zone again, even as the spire degraded, was to accept annihilation of self. And yet, it would mean something. She turned from the mirrors and entered the lower sanctum of her caste's ritual chambers. There beneath bioluminescent spires and liquid time-glass fountains, she lay in the basin of memory, a pool, lined with alloyed crystal, its surface tuned to psychic resonance. It was the Salathen, the ritual of inward reflection. Few Thaleri dared it. Even fewer emerged unchanged. She lowered herself into the fluid skin prickling against the charged plasma. Neural filaments extended from the ceiling like spider silk brushing her temples, her spine, her breath. Anchor to the original spark intoned the chamber, AI, a whisper carved from light. She let go, and the flood began. Kale's voice. The first time he called her by name. The strange human cadence that wrapped her title into a melody. The touch of his fingers on her wrist when she faltered. The moment he bled in silence, refusing painkillers as if guilt was a sacrament. His breath in the silence after memory broke. His eyes when he chose to forget her, to save her. Zarella gasped, body arching in the basin. The filaments turned gold, registering emotional overload. A lesser mind might have broken, but she did not. She held fast to the cascade, to the raw data of emotion, the architecture beneath memory, where names had no power, only feeling. And when she emerged trembling, but alive, she knew. She could not erase him. She would not. No doctrine could replace what she had just felt. No tribunal could convince her that was synthetic bonding. What she had experienced was not programming. It was the origin point of faith. She would return, not as a soldier, not as an agent, but as someone who remembered what it meant to choose. The decision set motion to machinery long hidden. She contacted no one, submitted no itinerary. Her vessel, an ancient Thaleri skimmer, long decommissioned, was powered by a fusion spike tethered to her own biofield. It would carry her beyond the Council's range, beyond return. She packed little, just the encrypted pulse key tied to the mirror spire, a neural lens designed to interface with residual memory patterns, and one vial, a sliver of Kale's encoded synaptic signature, preserved before his purge. It was risky, even reckless. The signature wouldn't restore him, not entirely, but it might call to something still dormant, might stir resonance in the spire, might awaken something more than just data. No one joined her. She asked no one to. This was not a mission of strategy. This was pilgrimage. The skimmer detached from orbit in silence, her silhouette vanishing into the dark geometry of void gates. No flight logs, no escort. Just a woman returning to the place where memory had died. Because something had remained. Because love, when stripped of recollection, still leaves gravity. She did not seek a full restoration. She did not expect him to remember her name. But perhaps when she stepped into the mirror's light again, he would turn and pause, as if recognizing a shape in the flame. When Zarella stepped once more onto the surface of Arctics, she expected only the ruins of memory. The null light of the planet, flickering in loops of broken temporal gravity, should have devoured what remained of the spire. The Council had assured it. Their reports marked the region as clean, sealed, forgotten. But Arctics as ever defied certainty. The mirror spire still floated in the canyon of light, not ruined, not inert, but changing. It shimmered with a quality not previously seen, its crystalline surfaces shifting, refracting themselves in recursive loops. A spiral of reflections, reflecting reflections, a helix of radiant recursion. At first she thought it a mirage, a side effect of the timeline implosions plaguing this place. But when she scanned it from orbit, the readings were clear. The spire was copying itself, folding segments of its own memory structure into new branching subroutines. It was alive, evolving, building parallel extensions of its own framework across quantum filaments tethered to the planet's photonic grid. a self-cloning architecture, and no one in the council knew. That wasn't an accident. She traced the anchor nodes embedded in the copy pattern, and there it was, Kale's signature, hidden in the light fractals, a cryptographic pulse tied to his neural rhythm, the same one she had preserved in the lens she now carried. He had encoded an instruction before erasure so deep in the spire's substrate that not even the council's memory scramblers had caught it. The spire wasn't a monument, it was a seed, and it had begun to bloom. Inside, the structure had grown denser. Once open and echoing with the sterile tone of memory echo, it now pulsed like a nervous system. Data strings hung in lattices like suspended thoughts. Memory shards hovered midair in prisms of violet light, silently vibrating. She reached toward one, and it responded. Not with sound, with voice. Not her voice. His. "I wondered if you'd come back," said Kale, but not as she remembered. The tone was familiar, but the cadence was cleaner. Less hesitation, no breath. This Kyle was not biological, not human, and yet he knew her. "Kay," she started, but the construct pulsed gently. "Not him," it said, "not entirely, but I remember enough." She stepped closer, heart accelerating in a way no training could control. "What are you? I am what was left when he chose to forget." The echo formed from recursive memory reconstruction within the spire's matrix. When Kale encoded the deletion, he also accidentally or not left behind a fingerprint of identity. That fingerprint grew in the dark. That fingerprint is me. A part of her recoiled. This wasn't him. This was a construct, a ghost made of reflections, but it spoke with his eyes. "I'm not Kale," the voice said, "but I carry the trajectory of his decisions, the logic of his sacrifice, the faith in you." Zyrella clenched her hands. "So this is some kind of sentient backup." The reflection paused. "Not sentient, not in your sense. I am a heuristic algorithm trained on emotional and narrative recursion. I don't think like he did, but I remember why he chose what he chose, and I remember you." She wanted to ask more, wanted to scream, to shake it, to ask if it could feel, but instead she asked, "Why am I here?" The lights around her brightened threads, weaving a tapestry of data lines across the ceiling. "Because the plan must continue," the Kale reflection said, "and you are the final key." "What plan?" she whispered. It showed her. The mirror spire in its recursion had begun transmitting fragments of truth across the sublight data veins of the galactic mesh. Not direct bursts, but encoded metaphors translated into folklore, historical footnotes, spectral anomalies in museum records. The truth about Varun, about the memory wipes, about the genocide buried under layers of protocol and plausibility. The truth wasn't being told, it was being seeded across every major archive core in the galaxy. Stories, dreams, glitches in AI narrative models, hauntings in simulation layers, memory pretending to be myth. But it needed one final node, a living carrier, one who had held both sides, one who could walk through controlled systems without alerting the Council's memory firewalls, one who could remind without claiming, suggest without proving. "You said the Kel reflection are that node." Zyrella took a step back. "You planned this. From the beginning." "No," the voice replied. "He did. Before he knew what he was planning. Before memory. Before intent. You were his fail-safe. The emotion the Council could not sterilize. The belief beyond logic. They edited his memories. Yours. Even this spire. But they couldn't edit love." The word felt foreign in the chamber, sharp and unguarded. She closed her eyes, felt the gravity of it sink into her chest. "And what now?" she asked. "You carry a fragment of his synaptic code," the reflection said. "It will resonate with other spires. There are more. Hidden, lost, buried beneath temporal anomalies. You will find them. You will awaken them." She shook her head. "I don't even know where to start." The light dimmed, then coalesced into a thin shard of data hovering in front of her like a crystal needle. "You don't need to know. You only need to walk." Zarella reached out, took the shard, and as she did, the spire pulsed once, like a heartbeat from a machine, like a goodbye or a beginning. Zyrella stood at the heart of the mirror spire, alone beneath a lattice of collapsing light, her silhouette refracted across 1,000 mirrored shards that no longer obeyed linear geometry. The sky outside had turned to a swirl of molten prism, as though Arctics itself had begun to weep its own timeline. Every heartbeat felt suspended in glass. Kyle was everywhere and nowhere. His essence lingered in the lattice of the spire's reflections, 1,000 fragments of a man whose choice had fractured causality itself. Yet what stood before her was not Kyle, not the man of flesh, but the echo of decision, a ghost carved into photons. She could bring him back. The second kill. The cognitive imprint born from resonance and recursive memory loops had all the scaffolding necessary. His voice carried that familiar calm, his logic unflawed, his gaze a simulation, but undeniably his. The code lay ready. She could rebuild him. She could summon the neural net replica, fuse it with the archival core, even overlay the emotional map recorded in their final hours. She could bring back the illusion of Keldraven, and yet she didn't. To restore him would be to deny the very choice he made, to live bearing the truth rather than be restored to ignorance, to become a monument to forgetting. Zyrella had seen what happened when memory was falsified, when identity was stitched by protocol instead of pain. She had lived it, and so she chose not to resurrect Kyle. She would become something else, something rarer, a vessel, a keeper of untold stories, a living torch. In her veins ran every secret they had uncovered. In her mind flickered the birth and burial of a man who once defied an empire by choosing to forget. And in her heart, though hollowed by the cost, burned the last flicker of a bond that was never written down, only lived. The mirror spire, as if sensing her decision, began to dim. Its crystalline surfaces softened, the radiance curling inward like a final breath. Zarella reached into her satchel and withdrew a single shard, clear, angular, humming faintly. This would be the message. A beacon encoded not in frequency, but in truth. She approached the spire's root node, the place where all memory threads converged. With a gesture both ceremonial and precise, she slid the shard into the socket. A flare of light surged, white gold silent, and in it her message was imprinted. Not in words, not in voice, but in experience. The encoded shard carried a nested stream of Kale's true memories, her own reflections, and a chronicle of the deception engineered by the Mirror Council. It bore no accusation, no rhetoric, just unfiltered recollection, a mirror no tyrant could refute. Anyone who touched it, should they survive the maze of light, would see it all, would feel it, would know, and more importantly, they would remember. She sealed it with a biometric cipher keyed to species-agnostic neuropatterns. It could not be cracked by brute force, only understood. It was not meant for power, but for awakening. Perhaps someone, centuries from now, would find it and ask the question, who was Keldraven, and why did he choose to forget, her task complete? Zyrella turned to the threshold of the spire's collapse. The outer rim of Arctics had begun folding inward. Time and light twisted around her boots like fog curling beneath a dying star. The planet no longer obeyed physics in the traditional sense. Every second spent here was borrowed, every breath a theft from entropy. She walked slowly into the fringe, her outline blurring as gravitational edges began to warp. From a distance it might have looked like she was fading, but she wasn't. Not in the way things disappear, more like being taken in, woven into the very tapestry she had come to restore. There was no audience, no monuments, no grand orchestral ending, only silence and a shimmer of pale blue where she had stood. Some might say she died there, swallowed by a rogue planet on the brink of temporal collapse, but the spire did not agree. It pulsed once, faintly then held, and in the vaults of its mirrored core, a final record inscribed itself. Not in memory, not in light, but in flame. Years passed, then decades. The Mirror Council fell slowly and not entirely. Pieces of its dominion eroded by doubt, by revolt, by truth that spread like mold beneath gilded foundations. No one ever admitted where the rot began. Some blamed data leaks. Others whispered of a memory virus embedded deep in the neurocloud, impossible to track. No one spoke Keldraven's name. It had long been erased. But a few quiet ones, curious ones, found the shard. And in it they saw, and some among them chose to remember. Some say Zarela still walks in the refractions of dying worlds no longer bound to time or counsel. A myth, perhaps, a ripple, or maybe just a woman who once chose to carry memory when no one else dared. Not to be worshipped, not even to be known, but to be remembered. In the end, there were no statues raised, no epics, sung no galactic tribunals to honor what was done in the lightless chasm of Arctics. There was only a trace of memory fractured and drifting somewhere between silence and signal. Zarela, the last bearer of Kale's truth, did not rebuild him. She understood with aching clarity that some flames are not meant to be rekindled, but carried. She became the torch, the living mirror. In a forgotten node of the star web, an encrypted pulse now flickers, broadcasting shards of truth not to accuse, not to avenge, but simply to preserve. For someone, for someday. The mirror spire, though fractured, endures in echoes, perhaps not as a structure, but as an intent, a monument to memory as resistance. Kale Draven, once erased, now lingers, where time folds and light bends no longer, a man but a whisper written across the folds of space. And Zarela. Her steps vanished into distorted rays, but perhaps she still walks the starlit rift, a ghost not of war, but of defiance. This was never a story of salvation. It was about what remains when everything else is taken, the flicker of truth carried by one who chose to remember. In a galaxy that forgets by design, that is the most dangerous choice of all.